Dr. Chloe Farahar and Dr. Zafi Cox from our School of Psychology. Ladies, over to you.
Thank you for that, Marcus. Yes, so I'm Chloe Farahar, and Zafi Cox is also supporting me today, just to sort of run things in the background as well and help with the Q&A session. Yes, this is what we're covering. So we're covering working with neurodiversity in mind and what we can actually learn from the lockdown in terms of how to support neurodivergent employees and potentially employers as well. So some ideas that perhaps people hadn't considered beneficial that maybe you can now take forward. So I won't go too much into the layout. Hopefully everyone's sort of seen that from sort of the adverts and things that Marcus has put up. But yes, I'm covering actually what neurodiversity is, because I'm quite used to people not really understanding the nuances of neurodiversity as a narrative, what some of the common neurodivergences are, how we can start to empathise with neurodivergent people based on some of the sort of struggles we've had during the lockdown that autistic or ADHD or people with mental health experiences have actually struggled with themselves. Look at a case study to try and get you to kind of take some of the theoretical ideas and consider how they might actually work in practice, and then actually consider some of the key costs and benefits and the challenges and strengths that people have experienced during the lockdown and how we can take those forward. And then ideally it would be great if anyone does consider some scenarios themselves about how maybe something they struggle with in terms of an employee that they have who's neurodivergent in some capacity. And I will be going over what these terms mean if you haven't come across them before. So just very briefly who I actually am. So my actual PhD was looking at how to reduce mental health stigma by using the neurodiversity narrative. And then I've sort of done lots of projects based on neurodiversity and how it can be very beneficial in lots of areas, not just businesses. And this is actually the first time I've kind of considered in more depth, I guess, what neurodiversity can mean in the workplace. I'm 36, and so I have 36 years of autistic experience, and so I'm kind of using some of my personal experiences as well to shape some of the ideas about how I've experienced lockdown, for instance, and some of my strengths and challenges that maybe you can see in your own employees and other neurodivergent employees that you might have, not just autistic. So this is just some of the things that I do with the university. Oh, somebody's just needs to mute because I can hear myself. We've been echoed. And I've done lots of training for about 7 years actually relating to neurodiversity and how that might support different groups. So whilst I haven't typically done businesses, you know, I've worked with Met Police and homeless charities and things like that to kind of understand what neurodiversity is and how it can apply in those settings. So this is a very quick sort of guide of how we would like to do some of the basic activities, because it's quite strange doing a Zoom when all I can see is myself really at this point in time. So Zafi, like I say, is also supporting me, and she's going to help by kind of collating any questions or anything like that so that I can just get through the actual presentation itself. So anytime you see that little red 3-person emoji, if you like, up in the corner, that means that ideally it would be great if you want to contribute somewhat in the chat section, in the chat box. So at any point, yeah, if you want to answer any questions that I may ask in the chat box, and you can either ask them directly so that it everybody can see your question, or if you'd rather it remained anonymous, which is absolutely fine, if you just change in the chat box from saying to everyone to have it privately messaged just Zafi. So this very, very first question is, what questions do you really want answered in this session? And then if I don't cover them, then Zafi is going to sort of collate them, and we can look at whether I've covered them at the end before the Q&A session, whether that's something that actually you'd like sort of explored during the Q&A. So you're welcome to do that while I carry on, and then, like I say, Zafi will collate those for me. So we're just starting off with what even is neurodiversity. You're also welcome to put your ideas of what you think neurodiversity is in the chat box, again anonymously or for everyone to see, and just kind of see if they match up with what I'm about to elaborate on in terms of what neurodiversity is. Okay, so neurodiversity, importantly, is a property of groups. So a lot of people mistakenly think, when we use the word neurodiverse, for instance, that it implies an individual person, and an individual can't be neurodiverse. Only groups can be diverse, so in terms of neurodiversity. So all of humanity is neurodiverse, as we all have different brains to one another, and no two brains are identical. So like I say, that's a really key thing to try and remember, that any group that you're in where there's 2 or more people is a neurodiverse group. And that will mean that you will have people, even if they would be considered to be neurotypical, so say non-autistic, not have attention differences or mental health concerns or something along those lines, even if they are neurotypical, they will have slightly different perceptions of the world, because no 2 brains are alike. And obviously this is going to be key to understanding why we kind of really have to think of individuals on an individual level. Now, I know we hear that all the time, and sometimes that can be quite difficult to implement, because that would be quite time consuming. So I guess when we start looking at different neurodivergences, so different types of brains that work in slightly different ways to what we would normally expect, that can kind of help us put in place sort of accommodations that might actually help all types of people and all types of brains. So I've got a very brief, and I'm hoping the sound will work on this actually, so let me just double check. Share computer sound, lovely. So I'm just going to play this very short video that Zafi and I actually created as part of a project that we're doing in the School of Psychology. Now, while we're referring to the School of Psychology here and students, it does actually apply in other settings as well.
Neurodiversity, the diversity of brains and minds, is a natural, healthy and valuable form of human diversity. And under this social paradigm, there is no normal or right style of human brain or human mind, any more than there is a one normal or right ethnicity, gender or culture. Within this paradigm, those whose behaviour, and thus brains, function in ways that diverge from ideals of neurotypicality are considered neurodivergent, where neurotypicality is the condition from which neurodivergent people diverge. Autistic people are considered a neurominority, and an individual autistic a neurodivergent person. There are many developmental and mental health differences that are examples of neurodivergence, such as autistic experience, attention differences, dyslexic and dyspraxic, all under the umbrella of neurodiversity, along with neurotypical people. Like everyone, neurodivergent people have strengths and challenges when interacting with the world. For autistic people, some of these challenges relate to sensory processing differences and differences in executive functioning. And while we should all be accommodating of neurodivergent challenges, it's important to remember the strengths too. My personal challenges as an autistic person include social difficulties in understanding other people and having atypical eye contact, which makes social situations anxiety-provoking and awkward, which takes a physical toll on my body. I'm also sensory sensitive and particularly touch averse, which is why I shave my head. Psychology attracts neurodivergent students looking to understand themselves. A school questionnaire found that anxiety and being asked to answer questions in class was a barrier to learning. And anxiety occurs for a number of people regardless of neurodivergence type and shouldn't be confused with nervousness. As a teacher, you don't need to know or understand student diagnoses to be able to make your teaching inclusive. There are some simple things you can do to make your seminars more inclusive, which work for a neurodiverse class where it's made up of both neurotypical and neurodivergent students. I use participation cards like those on the screen, where all students choose how they want to participate in that seminar. This may be the same student choice every week or change week to week. Neurodivergent people process the environment differently to those who are neurotypical. This can create challenges, but neurodivergence can also be a strength. There are simple ways we can help students so that they are understood, accepted and accommodated. And part of this is realising your way of experiencing the world is only one of many. Thank you for watching this brief introduction to neurodiversity inclusive teaching.
Okay, so like I say, yes, that was about neurodivergent inclusive teaching, but there's definitely things that you can take from neurodiversity as a narrative and a paradigm into the workplace as well. Because like I say, any group where there's 2 or more people is neurodiverse. So in your workplace, you will have a mix largely of what we would arguably say are societally neurotypical. So people, like I said, who wouldn't be considered to have a neurodivergence like autistic or attention differences, dyslexia or dyspraxia. And so it will be made up of both neurotypical and neurodivergent employees. And while I was struggling to try and find some good statistics on how many neurodivergent employees would be in the workplace in general, and that'll be for a number of reasons, that statistic will be quite hard to find. For instance, people not knowing that they're neurodivergent and also not disclosing that they're neurodivergent. I did find a statistic that states that 1 in 7 people are neurodivergent. And again, I'm going to give some examples in a minute of types of neurodivergence if you're not too sure what that word actually means. But I just think that's quite an important thing to remember. So every time, 1 in 7 people is definitely going to have a neurodivergence of some description. So I just thought I'd give you some brief ideas of common neurodivergences that you will come across, but they are so numerous because, like I say, brains are so diverse within the human population. I'm not going to go through this slide, but it's just to demonstrate there's so many different ways for brains to experience the world. And so within the neurodiversity narrative as a sort of an idea and a concept, you can consider things like dyslexia, like say Tourette's syndrome, autism, ADHD, as well as mental health actually as a neurodivergent, so a different way of experiencing the world. As well, within that neurodiversity are also neurotypical people who don't experience any of these things as well. So some of the key neurodivergences, I'm only going to cover, I think I'm covering 4 here. So autistic, the autistic population themselves as a community are around 1.1 to 1.5% of the population, and the figure keeps growing. So we're sort of starting to see a lot more autistic people discovering their autistic identity later in life and getting later diagnosed. So in terms of the challenges that autistic people face, including myself, some of the key ones are misunderstanding or struggling to understand the complexities of social interaction. And that's not the same as not being able to socially interact. It just means that there's some difficulties when interacting with non-autistic people. And it also can be a challenge to understand how you yourself as an autistic person comes across to others who aren't autistic. So that's where some of my key struggles have been, which is how are people perceiving me and understanding me when I'm communicating? So I've had to work quite hard to communicate in a way that I feel is understood by others. Some very key challenges for autistic people, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, will be sensory input issues and differences. So issues relating to noise, heat, light and touch can be an issue for many autistic people. And those are kind of the main ones that we would consider. So like I say, the noise one you would be, I would arguably say is quite common that you would imagine an autistic person struggling with. But actually anything sensory wise can be a struggle for us, including something called proprioception, which is the ability to know where your body is in space. So it's actually quite a key thing to understand that sensory needs are a challenge. There can also be co-occurring anxiety. So anxiety is actually quite high in the autistic population in general, as a rule, because of the struggles identifying or understanding social interaction, and also the sensory issues can cause anxiety. So if we take that into account, that can kind of help you even start to think about, okay, well, those are the challenges, so how can we reduce those so that anxiety is lessened, for instance. But while, like I say, in the little video that I show, it is important to understand the challenges, but it's also really important to understand the strengths as well, because otherwise you are just considering yourself, for instance, if you are neurodivergent, in terms of things that you struggle with, and not focusing on the things that actually you can bring to a workplace. So the strengths sometimes for autistic people can be problem solving and analytical thinking, having very innovative thinking and detailed observational skills, and having an intrinsic enjoyment when you work on projects that interest you. So if it is something that really interests an autistic person, they will work very, very hard on that, and probably not get bored as well. So they won't lose that enjoyment and motivation to actually work on a project, which I think is quite an important strength, actually, because I think if you consider some of your employees who perhaps have to do the same tasks, or working on the same project for quite a long time, they might become demotivated or lose interest, where that might not happen with an autistic person if it is something that interests them intrinsically, so personally. So attention differences is what is typically referred to as ADHD or ADD without the hyperactivity. But we're focusing here on the attention differences per se, as opposed to thinking of it as a disorder, because we're trying to think about how do these individuals want to work in the workplace. And this, you can see, is 2.5 to up to 4% of the population. Again, so you know there's a number of people that we might come across with attention differences. So some of the key challenges for people diagnosed with ADHD or ADD are inattention, perhaps, so difficulties with concentration, short-term and working memory, and difficulties planning and getting started. So the activation or actually beginning a task can be quite a struggle. You've also got impulsiveness, perhaps, and like I say, if they also have the ADHD diagnosis, the hyperactivity. Typically, adults who were diagnosed as children, or actually adults diagnosed later in life, they kind of start to reduce that hyperactivity, and that, not that they grow out of it, but that it's not as prominent as perhaps the inattention and impulsiveness once they become an adult. And these are just some lovely, there's lots of lovely memes from these different communities, and this is one from the ADHD community. So yeah, what the hell is that? Oh, just my mind. So the mind being incredibly busy and kind of all over the place for some people with attention differences. Again, focusing on the strengths of people with attention differences is this ability to hyper-focus on things of interest. And you can see that there's some similarities here with autistic experience. And that's because the boundaries for what is classed as ADHD and autism can actually be quite blurred. So you might see some of these things like hyper-focus within the autistic community, as well as those within the ADHD community. And then you also get autistic people who also have attention differences too. Some of the strengths for those with attention differences might be willingness to take risks. So dependent on the type of business that you have, that might be quite an important thing. They can be quite spontaneous and flexible, actually quite good in a crisis, and potentially have quite creative ideas and think outside the box. In terms of dyslexia, that's actually 10% of the population. So this is quite a common neurodivergence that you would probably come across. And it varies again within that community itself. So the challenges perhaps for those with dyslexia, it's classed as a specific learning difficulty. And so these individuals might have difficulty with reading, writing or spelling. And then they might have a difficulty or difference processing and remembering information seen and heard. Again, thinking about some strengths of these individuals, it's been noted that A lot of dyslexic people have quite good 3D visual thinking, and so a very good visual memory, potentially have quite a good long-term memory, novel problem-solving ideas because they're having to work around the things that they struggle with, and also strong communication skills. And again, I quite like this meme, which is, why is dyslexic such a hard word to spell? In terms of dyspraxia, which is slightly an outdated term, so it's now classed as a development coordination condition, but we still refer to it typically as dyspraxia, is around nearly 6% of the population. And so some of the challenges for these individuals will be difficulties with fine and or gross motor skills. They might have atypical perception, so vision and hearing might be different. And what I was mentioning before within autistic sensory differences also can occur in dyspraxic individuals, which is the issues with proprioception, which is quite a difficult word to pronounce. So like I say, the ability to know where your body is in space. Might also struggle with organisation and working memory. And I've popped Daniel Radcliffe down there because he's quite openly dyspraxic and talked about his struggles with dyspraxia. So some of the strengths that people with dyspraxia might exhibit is strong verbal comprehension and communication abilities, problem solving, pattern spotting, creativity and reasoning. So there's lots of things here that you can actually work on as a strength for these different types of neurodivergent experiences. Very important, because that was a very quick whistle stop of just 4 types of neurodivergence, because I didn't want to focus on that too much. I wanted to focus more on the benefits of neurodiversity for you. But very importantly, because that's such a really brief overview of some quite complex ways of experiencing the world, it's important to remember that everybody obviously is different. So no 2 autistic people are the same way that no 2 neurotypical people are the same either. And so within these different communities and populations, the diversity is just as variable. And you will have some, for instance, autistic people who are sensory sensitive to noise, where others are not, and then they may have a different sensitivity to perhaps tactile sensations, so shaking hands and things like that, just to show that there is such a diversity within those communities. So here we've got again a little activity. So because everyone has strengths and challenges, and it's important to not focus on this idea that to be neurodivergent means you must be challenged by your environment quite a lot, although that is the case, it's quite important to remember that regardless of your neurotype, you will have your own strengths and challenges. So if you could pop in the chat box, that would be great, to think about where you work yourself and potentially one of your employees or colleagues, and consider what their challenges might be and what you perhaps have noticed that they find difficult within that environment. Also, though, consider what potential strengths that they have. And then what I'd really like is if people can consider your own strengths and challenges. Ideally, it would be really good if you could think of perhaps 2 of your own strengths and 2 of your own challenges. And as a reminder, you can just post them directly to Zafi if you'd rather not post them publicly in the chat box. I think I'll only give like a minute, and then I'll kind of just leave people considering those things before we move on to the next slide. Okay, hopefully people are thinking and popping a few things down in the chat box, or will be. In case you're struggling to consider how to answer those questions, I thought I would give you a couple of mine. I did have these kind of very briefly in the little video at the beginning, but this is to consider my own personal challenges and strengths. And so I think I mentioned already that autistic people, and myself included, can have potentially social difficulties in understanding other people. So sometimes, and when I say that, it's typically non-autistic people. So actually, autistic people can understand each other, that's very generally speaking, but typically rather well, because we experience the world in a similar way. So whilst I do sometimes struggle to understand non-autistic people and the interactions with them, I also struggle, like I said before, in understanding how people perhaps perceive me and how I come across. And because of this, I've kind of put in place things so that people can understand me without me not being myself. So within my own emails, for instance, I have at the bottom a sort of little note that just explains that it's quite hard to convey sort of tone and intonation in an email. And so I will always kind of be blunt and to the point. And that's so that people don't think that I'm being rude if I don't ask the sort of the social niceties at the beginning or the end, sort of, how are you doing today? Which I always find quite bizarre to do in an email. I really do struggle with unexpected or unanticipated change. So surprises for me are quite difficult because my brain kind of likes to work with plans and being able to visualize how something's going to go. So in terms of a project or even going to the shops and things like that. So whilst I do actually manage well with change, it needs to be either on my terms so I know it's happening, you know, I'm the one that maybe instigated the change, or somebody actually sort of supporting me to understand why the change is happening. And a good example is I had to move offices halfway through my PhD, and our administrative manager knew or recognised that I might struggle with that, and so let me know well ahead of time that I would have to move offices, and then actually sat me down and said which office might suit you as well. So and that was really good because one of the options was a very big room with 10 other students, and I would not have been able to manage in a space like that because of the sensory overwhelm from lots of people working at once. I do have sensory issues, so like I say, I do have issues with sound, smell, light and touch, and that's actually a picture of me trying to support some of my students who are also autistic to feel comfortable doing things that make them feel able to regulate the sensory overwhelm that they might be experiencing. So that's a little squishy toy that smells quite nice. So when I'm quite stressed, I quite like the smell of that. And also got a pair of headphones in. And sometimes I wear earplugs as well if I'm teaching. And the room is kind of getting to a point where there's lots of discussion going on, table discussions going on, and so I can still facilitate that space. I put earplugs in just to sort of reduce the noise and the sound, and allows me to still be able to work. So my potential strengths are, I do have a deep focus and concentration on things that interest me. I've been fascinated by neurodiversity for absolute years now, and I don't know if that's ever going to wane. I have an intense empathy for people, which works quite well within the sort of field that I've gone into, which is social psychology, and looking at how to reduce sort of stigma around certain neurodivergences and different minority groups. I say what I mean and mean what I say, so I'm quite to the point. You know, you don't have to work out hidden meanings and things like that. I'm very organised, and I do have quite a creative way of considering things, and I think outside the box. So for me, in any workplace, and I haven't always been in academia, I was actually at one point working in a very, very busy customer focused retail store, and at the time I didn't know I was autistic, and I kind of know now why I really struggled with some of the things that you have to do with customer facing, such as eye contact. But now I know what my strengths are, and so I can play to those and then ask for my employer to help with the things that I might be challenged by. So things that are important, I guess, not just for me, but for people to understand my experiences of the world are different to a lot of neurotypical people, and to understand the language that I feel is important for me to discuss me and my experiences. So for me, I don't consider myself disordered, and at present autism is not classed as a mental illness or anything like that. It's classed as a neurodevelopmental difference, disability or condition. So the reason I'm saying this is to consider the sort of narrative around mental health, around autism, ADHD, all these neurodivergences, and either talk about it in a kind of neutral way, or ideally sort of a realistic and positive way if possible. And the reason for that is to help with the culture within the employment, you know, within businesses, so that people don't feel they have to hide who they are. So there are plenty of autistic people, people with attention differences, mental health issues, who don't disclose how they experience the world and that they have those diagnoses, for instance. And actually that's quite exhausting to mask who you actually are and how you might be struggling with things because you don't want to come across as autistic, for instance. So it's really important to start thinking about what is it actually your work culture in terms of diversity and in terms of neurodiversity particularly. Important for me would be for my own employer to understand that because a behaviour doesn't make sense necessarily to you, it doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. So again, I still struggle to pop that picture up of me as a 36-year-old, you know, woman, academic, professional, with what's classed as a STIM toy, so an object that helps me regulate when I'm getting sensory overwhelmed, for instance. So I find it quite hard to put that picture up. I still feel uncomfortable because I'm still concerned that people will judge me negatively for something that doesn't harm other people, and actually helps me carry on with my job and carry on with my work. And the same going, but perhaps less so, with perhaps the earphones and things like that. So just because those behaviours might look a little bit odd, as long as they're allowing that person to be productive and it's you know, not really distressing or distracting other people, it's important to understand it's just a behaviour you just don't necessarily get. Doesn't mean you can't. You might find out about it and learn about it from your employee, and it just means it's not your kind of weird. And my go-to is that if you actually think about human beings on the whole, we're very odd creatures, and there's so many different kinds of weird within our species. And once you find your group who you identify and you have a lot of shared similarities, so me finding the autistic community was fantastic because it meant, yeah, I've always been weird, always been a bit odd, but actually it just meant that I hadn't found my group of weird. So trying to understand those behaviours is really important. So again, if you're able to, in the chat boxes, which would be great, have a consider this scenario. So you have an autistic employee who's expected to greet customers with a smile and eye contact. They cannot. They really struggle with that for numerous reasons, and some of that might be sensory, and it might be that the way they process the world is very visual. So to concentrate on a person's face is very distracting. So they can't do that, but they get great customer service feedback due to their knowledge. So I guess what I'm asking is it that important to kind of enforce this idea of they need to do the smile and the eye contact to be able to do really good customer service? What could you potentially do to help that autistic employee not feel so uncomfortable or be expected to do that? And is that possible? And it depends on also what kind of business you have. So obviously I am focusing here on the idea of customer facing. So any thoughts on that? Pop it in the chat box. Okay, so that was literally just trying to get to a point where perhaps if you're not that aware about neurodiversity, hopefully you've got a slightly better idea what it is and what it kind of covers. So now it's kind of moving on to what have we actually learned then from the lockdown? And to some extent, I think we could take some things away from it about empathizing with neurodivergent experiences. So if you yourself are neurotypical, you know, there are some things that we've experienced during the lockdown that you might empathise more readily with, for instance, autistic people or people with social anxiety and things along this line. So I'm assuming which is kind of ironic given that we're all on Zoom right now, that people are aware of Zoom fatigue. And I think Zoom fatigue has been an interesting, fascinating and unexpected thing to come out of the lockdown, out of the pandemic. I think it could potentially give us a glimpse into the exhaustion experienced by people such as myself, and also, like say, people with social anxiety or any other neurodivergent experiences outside of Zoom. So Zoom fatigue is the exhaustion, weariness and tiredness we experience using online meeting platforms like Zoom. Video chats mean we need to work harder to process non-verbal cues like facial expressions, the tone and pitch of the voice, and body language. Paying more attention to those consumes a lot of energy. So if you weren't aware perhaps why you're so tired when you do lots of Zoom meetings, this is good to try and demonstrate what that might be actually happening when you get so tired. So potentially, these are some of the reasons that we experience Zoom fatigue. So we feel out of sync, and that's particularly the case when somebody's got a very patchy Wi-Fi, and very frustrating because they keep dropping out of signal and things like this. We end up talking over one another or accidentally interrupting one another or hogging the floor. And it is even harder to do on Zoom, or easier even for the talking over one another and accidentally interrupting one another for some reason than it is in real life. And particularly if you've got maybe 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people on this very small screen. It might be hard for us to figure out when to interject into a conversation on Zoom. You've also got the issues of sensory bombardment, particularly if people haven't realised that they could probably mute themselves when they're not actually talking. You might have crying children in the background. There might be an unidentified tapping or whirring noise. You've got cats walking across keyboards, which does happen to me quite a lot, which distracts everybody. And there might be embarrassing moments. I've definitely seen some sort of memes and things like this where somebody accidentally took their phone, for instance, for a Zoom meeting into the toilet with them, which was very uncomfortable. We feel like we're being watched, because we are, but also that means that you feel like you're on stage. So it becomes incredibly performative to some extent. So you might feel that you're being scrutinised for your behaviour. You know, are you doing things right? Are you moving right? Are you moving enough? Are you moving your arms too much? And many neurodivergent people feel like this offline all the time, all their life. So all those things I've just described that happen on Zoom can happen for autistic people, for instance. And so you can imagine how you might more readily empathise then with an autistic individual who gets exhausted and burnt out from being in social interaction so much, because we might struggle with talking over one another, not knowing when to interject, and it's so constant thinking about, oh, is it my turn to, should I talk now? Oh wait, no, they need to finish. And that's constantly going on. It's quite it uses up a lot of cognitive resources to do that for autistic people offline, off of Zoom. And yeah, sound familiar? Basically, it sounds like an autistic experience of a social interaction. Also, interestingly, when it comes to the platforms like Zoom, there's research that demonstrates that delays on phone or conferencing systems shapes our views of people negatively. So even delays of 1.2 seconds makes people perceive the responder as less friendly or focused. So yes, when you're on a Zoom meeting, and like I say, there is that delay because the Wi-Fi is not very good, you get frustrated and you're like, oh, come on, get your Wi-Fi sorted. And so those delays, even though they're very short, makes people feel or perceive that individual as less friendly or focused. So if you imagine that, for instance, autistics process the world slightly differently, and sometimes for me, my processing speed in real time, so having a conversation with somebody, I kind of do need this 1.2 seconds to really filter through, right, what have they asked me? I need to filter out the noise of in the background, which is very difficult and sometimes impossible. So if I do that regularly as an autistic person off of Zoom, then does that mean that people are having this sort of negative perception of me regularly? And so this is really just to help you be aware, particularly if, like say, you've got autistic individuals, people with attention differences, anybody who experiences this sort of slightly difference in processing speeds in social interactions. Are you then having this negative perception of them yourselves? So you kind of really investigate how you feel if that's the case, and go, okay, actually I need to think to myself, it's just that they process the world slightly differently to me, and be aware of those kind of inner feelings that you might have towards those people. So autistics often take longer to process the words we hear, formulate a response and speak it. So what a social disadvantage it must create if it's causing people to view us as less friendly or focused. And so the good to come out of Zoom fatigue here is, I quite like this quote. So this is, if you are socially disoriented by Zoom and you're desperate for the pandemic to be over so you can return to a comfortable or easier socialization or socializing, please lean into that feeling and remember it later. So for me and for many autistic people, there is no end to that experience. It is where we live, and it is why some of us are among the most anxious people you'll ever meet. So yeah, lean into the feelings that you're having from things like Zoom. I won't go into this in loads of detail because you will get a copy of my slides, but this is just to consider, if you're going to carry on using Zoom and you do have neurodivergent and neurotypical people using Zoom, can you actually reduce the issues from Zoom fatigue? So like today, Marcus asked everyone to turn their audio and their cameras off for lots of reasons, but some of it's actually quite good for me. It means I don't get distracted by, like I say, weird coughing in the background, which I don't know where it's coming from, or tapping and this kind of thing. It's also possible that you might have individuals who find it very anxiety provoking to be on this sort of platform. So is it okay for them to use audio only, text only, and just use the Q&A box, for instance? And certainly don't expect eye contact. And it's a very weird platform anyway, because where do we actually look? Do we look in the camera? Do we look at ourselves? Do we look at the other people? So yeah, just don't make people necessarily feel uncomfortable if they can't do some of those things. And I have actually heard of some, I think it was some lecturers in some other schools actually kind of insisting on the students making or trying to make eye contact on Zoom, which again, I don't know how that would work. Yeah, so all these things, like I say, will be quite useful in a Zoom type environment. So here I have a case study of a chef with attention differences. And again, this is just to give you an idea of some of the challenges that somebody might have who's neurodivergent, and how an employer might actually overcome them or try to support that person. So for people with attention differences, there can be some struggles with executive functioning. So all human beings arguably have this sort of executive functioning ability, and it includes some of the things you can, or all of the things that you can see on the screen here. It includes working memory, the ability to plan and prioritize, impulse control, organization, all these kinds of things. So if you imagine that people with attention differences really struggle with executive functioning, so a number of these things here, you can kind of see why that might be quite challenging, or the environment might challenge them. So you've got a chef who loves being a chef and is in a very busy environment, and he is challenged in the workplace from working to his best ability, because he's good at the job, good at being a chef, and making really good meals and this kind of thing, but he's, like I say, challenged by the environment in the ability to work to his best ability. Potentially he has difficulty or difference with his communication style. So for other people, he might come across as impulsive, blunt, black and white, and quite literal in how he talks. And the impulsive bit might be quite difficult, because if you're imagining a chef in a very, very busy restaurant, I kind of do end up imagining Gordon Ramsay. And he's well known enough now, I guess, for being very impulsive, being very angry as a chef. But this might not work well, this impulsiveness and this blunt black and white thinking, for other people to work with this potential chef here. So if you have this chef, can you suggest ways that you could adapt the environment? So we're not expecting him to change his neurodivergence, because that would not really be possible. It's not possible to really change those executive functioning differences and difficulties. So how can we actually adapt the environment to accommodate for that difference? So in terms of being impulsive, blunt, black and white and literal. So I guess what I might really be asking is, what can you do to ensure that there's not clashes, for instance, between this chef and the other members of staff? So any thoughts on that would be great. Okay. The chef also struggles with timekeeping. Again, if you now look at that executive functioning wheel, you can understand why, and that it's not something that he's doing out of, he's not lazy, he's not being disrespectful, it's just his brain really struggles with timekeeping. So because of that executive functioning difficulty, he has difficulty starting, stopping and switching tasks and estimating time. I'm not necessarily asking for suggestions on how you might adapt the environment or what you might consider to support him with that, but it's just something to be aware of when we're talking about attention differences and somebody you might employ. So, okay, they were a couple of his challenges or things that challenged him in his workplace, but it also ignores his strengths if we only focused on those things that were challenging. So potentially, if you were an employee, you employed that chef, and those two things that he found difficult in that workplace came up repeatedly, you might think, well, I'm going to have to let him go. But again, if you can think of ways of accommodating and then focusing on his strengths, actually, you might be able to keep on somebody who's very, very good at their job. So his ignored strength might be that he's actually a very good fit for his interest and skills. Loves being a chef. He hyper focuses on the job. So he's really intrinsically motivated, enjoys it, and will always do a good job at creating great meals, getting everything just perfect every time. And he doesn't get bored with it as well. So he's not likely to want to leave that role. He's going to have some loyalty to stay there because he loves the job so much. It's good for him because he's on his feet all the time. It allows him to move. So to some extent, actually, that plays into his strengths and kind of compensates for the things he might be challenged with in terms of needing to move and the issues of hyperactivity, for instance. He copes well. That was me reminding myself where I am at half time. He copes well with the stimulating and fast-paced environment and the incoming demands. And a lot of people might not be able to manage that at all, particularly in a very busy restaurant, for instance. So actually, he's got some really keen strengths that might need to be fostered there. Here, we might actually see potentially communication and understanding deficits of the employer. So if you have this individual and you're kind of like focusing on the things that they're challenged by, and like I say, it might be a case you're like, we're going to have to let them go, you know, and not focusing on those strengths. Is it possible to go and get some nice, decent basic training on managing a neurodivergent employee to keep somebody who might be very loyal and do really, really well at the job when they've got the structure there in place? And so that's something quite important, because I have been aware of in some employment place, like some businesses, somebody going to them and saying, I'm neurodivergent, I have this diagnosis of ADHD, for instance, you know, what kind of things can you do to support me? Because sometimes neurodivergent people themselves don't actually know either, so they're not too sure. And having that employer come back and say, that's fine, I'm going to look into it, and just doing a bit of Google searching, it's not quite the same, and they might never still really understand some of the key things that that person struggles with. So to support this employee with attention differences, so when it came to that time management thing, it might be something as straightforward as agreeing a 15-minute start and finish time window rather than a rigid fixed start time with sanctions for being slightly late. So as long as they're doing the work, that they're there when the restaurant's open, for instance, because we're thinking about the chef, you know, are these sorts of accommodations actually possible? And as long as they're, you know, working the allotted hours that they're or contracted for. Is it possible to allow the employee to delegate some non-core aspects of the job which they find particularly difficult to complete, such as completing paperwork or timesheets, for instance? So they say they really struggle with that because of some of their executive function issues. Is that actually something that could be given to somebody else and that they pick up a different type of role or job to kind of compensate? Can we modify the environment to some extent? So perhaps use more visual aids as opposed to relying on their memory, which again will be a struggle for people with attention differences. So we can have these sorts of charts up to remind them. Can we consider the physical environment for somebody with attention differences? So can we having other staff members make sure that the environment's sort of set out with the right tools and things the night before, so they just get right into it as soon as they come in? Can we have a physical visual clock on the wall as well to kind of help manage with that difficulty with timekeeping and managing time throughout the day? And can we reduce distraction? So dependent on health and safety, can they wear headphones to really cut out background distraction and really just focus on what their task is at hand? It also might be, again, dependent on where we are in terms of the business setting, can we modify the working and management practices? So can you offer increased supervision, check-ins and feedback, and make it clear that that's voluntary? It's not something being imposed. It's not because they're a bad employee or anything like that. You genuinely want to make sure, has things worked for you this week? Were the things that we could have perhaps changed or accommodated or adjusted for you? And okay, you might do that more often than you would with other employees, but it might also preempt any other problems coming up. So instead of problems sort of mounting for months or, you know, a few months at a time, you can really catch those things much more quickly. And then you don't have to be concerned that you have to let them go, look for somebody new, somebody who perhaps isn't actually as good at the main core aspects of the job, by just doing these little sort of steps in between. Can we help break down tasks and allow regular movement breaks, which would be very important for somebody with attention differences? And that's just a picture of some fidget objects, which I think lots of people are aware of now, aware of like fidget spinners and things like that. But they don't have to be quite so childlike, but just objects that allow for sort of the build-up of energy to be released when somebody has attention differences. Okay. So in terms of what other things could we learn in terms of the pandemic and being on lockdown? So what benefits for some neurodivergent workers have actually come out of being locked down? So costs and benefits. So we have got some costs. So actually it's not all rosy for a lot of neurodivergent people to be at home, where I think there's kind of quite a black and white thinking that, you know, autistic people must love being at home and not having to leave the house or see other people or be in social situations in the workplace. But it's not all great. So for instance, for lots of people, not just autistic people, including people with attention differences, people with social anxiety, there's been a destruction of routine. So a lot of people are used to getting up at certain times and, you know, going off to work. And for many people who are neurotypical, that is probably quite frustrating and just an annoyance that it's destroyed your routine. But when routine is really important for your neurology, when you're autistic, for instance, that destruction of routine is very distressing, and it's been quite hard for a lot of people to actually create a routine in the home that they're not used to. So the lockdown is also enforced as opposed to allowed for voluntary isolation. So I'm quite happy working at home. Not that I don't like people, but it's very exhausting to, again, figure out how to socially interact and things like that. So for me, being at home is not an issue. So the isolation is not an issue. But for many, because it's been enforced, it's not controllable. It's been quite problematic for people. And like we've already mentioned, the issues of Zoom fatigue. So the costs for neurodivergent and neurotypical employees and employers. So this doesn't matter what your neurology is. There's something quite interesting that seems to be coming up now, which is just this idea of re-entry anxiety. Now, is this just a buzz phrase? Well, when I started looking into it and thinking about it, I think this is quite an important thing to consider, particularly if you're an employer and for yourself as well as an individual. So there's a lot of anxiety for many people about the idea of going back out into the world and being around multiple people again. And this is not solely about worrying about getting the virus. It's actually, you're so used to being around very small numbers of people, or maybe you've been on your own completely isolated, that it's quite distressing to then suddenly be around people again. And like I say, this is regardless of neurotype. So anxiety at being around people and multiple people again, especially given how the pandemic instilled fear of being close to others due to a contagion of a virus, but also because not being around people and is sensory taxing environments and so on has been relieving for many neurodivergent people. So many don't want to go back to normal. So this is quite important to think about. Do you want to go back to normal? What should that even look like? And is it even possible at the moment? Will it ever be possible again, I guess, as well? So, and I think that's quite key. So I really have struggled when I do leave the house because I'm so used to the world being so much quieter, more controlled. You know, my sensory overwhelm that I might experience on a regular basis is quite reduced because I can control my environment. So when I have gone into food shops and things like that, my senses are all of a sudden being bombarded, and it's quite overwhelming. Oh, and a funny little gif of what it might feel like to be around people again. So neurodivergent people who may struggle with this idea of re-entry anxiety, and like I say, autistic, perhaps socially anxious people with general anxiety conditions, and perhaps those with obsessive compulsive needs, so concern about, like I say, catching the virus, for instance. We also do have some benefits, and these things are what I'd really like people to consider to take forward for your neurodivergent employees, so the people that actually work for you. So social distancing has actually been very welcomed by neurodivergent people. I will be very happy if the sort of routine of not shaking hands, you know, if that stays. I'm quite happy with that. And then I don't have to keep relying on I don't shake hands, you can have an awkward wave kind of thing. So if it's the norm, that's fantastic. There's a lot less social demands, obviously, from being at home and things like this. So just consider, particularly if you are eventually going to be going back to workplaces, just think about that. How can you actually reduce those social demands? And not necessarily just for neurodivergent people. Again, it is quite bizarre going from being so isolated to suddenly being around other people. And I recently had one person come visit me after weeks and weeks of just being me and my partner and the cat. And it was very bizarre. And we're very close, she's a very good friend. And I had to say to her, because she was sitting next to me, I said, can you not sit so close or look at me? It feels really weird to have somebody here instead of on Zoom here. So, which was great, she did, because she knew it made me uncomfortable. Some things that have been really great, that would be great if people could take forward, are relaxed work hours. People have been able to work when they have the energy and when they want to, and it makes us more productive. I am not a morning person. You will get so much more out of me later in the day, and I work into the night, and that's just how my energy levels kind of work, and it means you'll get more out of me. It's allowed, like I say, for a controlled environment, apart from the interruptions from deliveries and things like that, and the cats walking across screens. and it's allowed for flexibility. So relating to all these things, but again, work hours can be flexible, and nobody knows what you're wearing. You know, a lot of people I know when they go on Zoom now, I mean, I've got flip-flops on right now. A lot of people when they go on Zoom now are professional from sort of like the waist up, and then are wearing like jogging bottoms on the bottom. So before lockdown was implemented and prior to the need of such crucial arrangements, it was less likely that employers would be open to the idea of flexible working for their employees. However, as employers have been forced into a situation where employees have to work from home, employers may be more open-minded and continue to innovate in the future with regard to taking on employees who would not typically fit into the traditional office 9-to-5 role. So that's not even about the employees that you have at present. That's also about, actually, if I can be flexible, I can really take on some people that I wouldn't normally have been able to take on. People with childcare concerns, disabled people, all sorts of people. You'd be able to bring in new skills from people that you wouldn't normally have been able to. Benefits of the lockdown to take forward for the employers. Okay, that last slide was about your employees, but what about you guys if you're employers? So you will be able to work with people you would not usually. So geographically, can you actually start working with somebody online halfway across the country? Do they even need to be in an office? You know, and if they were a talent that you really wanted for your business, and for them, they really weren't happy to move, they didn't want to move, so you were going to lose that talent, actually you might be able to now take on board those people. Those with skills and potential to contribute to your organisation who would not have been able to before. So like I say, childcare or individuals who are disabled might now be able to work with you. Productivity, so the things I mentioned before, if you can see how, you know, work pattern differences and energy at different times of the day means that that person will work when they have the energy, you're going to get much more productivity. Loyalty. Now this one I found quite interesting. So when I was doing lots of research for this webinar, and I knew this on an intrinsic level, but it's just really interesting as well. You will have quite loyal neurodivergent employees if you kind of put lots of these things in place. It might be by nature. So although that's a generalization, for instance, many, although not all, autistic people might be quite loyal in the workplace because they like the routine and things like that, and they like the job. But also, if you're taking care of your neurodivergent employees where they've perhaps had really quite poor work experiences, which sadly is the norm for a lot of neurodivergent people, they'll be really loyal because they're like, why would I leave this? This is a great job. And then you, again, don't have to worry about looking for new staff every so often. So how else can we move forward post-lockdown with neurodiversity in mind? So how can we actually make this neurodiverse friendly workplace? So again, it's neurodiverse friendly, so it means all types of brains, including the neurotypical brain as well. So awareness, acceptance, accommodation and promotion of neurodiversity is really important and key. So it might be about getting training for all your staff, including your neurodivergent staff. So again, just because somebody is autistic doesn't necessarily mean that they know what accommodation needs they have. And so how can they tell you? So if you all get training, it might start to sort of open up, okay, this would actually make me more productive if I could sit with my headphones on and perhaps not be in the big office with lots of other members of staff, for instance. So can you have your workplace assessed for practical and simple changes? And they really can be very simple. So, you know, asking employers to make changes, I can understand that that would be time, it comes across as time consuming and perhaps worrying about costs and how you're actually going to afford those changes. But they can be quite simple. It might even just be as simple as replacing really awful fluorescent lights or something along those lines. But can you have somebody, you know, come in who knows about this and just do an assessment of the space, for instance, if you're back in the workplace, that is. Can you foster an openly neurodiverse friendly culture? So tackle that stigma. And this is quite important because, again, some places might not be aware that they have neurodivergent staff. That might be because they don't feel comfortable yet to discuss it with other people, and it might be that they feel the environment isn't actually a safe place to be openly autistic or have attention differences or socially anxious or any of these sorts of things. And when you hear sort of stereotypes being used or derogatory language relating to oh yeah, well they're a bit aughty, aren't they, or and they're talking about a non-autistic person and they're kind of using it in that jokey kind of way, can you call it out and say, that's not really appropriate? So create a space where actually neurodivergent people will want to come and work. And lots of companies, big companies, have started long ago actually doing this. So places like Google and things like that, they make their spaces neurodivergent friendly because they know they're going to get amazing employees out of that. Attract and retain a neurodiverse talent pool. So do you actually have a role that might work for different or certain types of neurodivergence? So an autistic person, someone with attention differences, can you actually advertise in a way that's not the bog sort of standard way of advertising that attracts those people? So if it's not a job that's customer facing and it's actually not paramount that they're really good at social communication, does that have to be in the advert to say, because that will put off a lot of people who really struggle with those things when it says must be really good at I don't know, communicating with everybody at all levels. It's not to say that they wouldn't be able to do that, but it might put them off because it would create anxiety for them to be put in that situation. And if it's not actually part of the role, really, does it need to be there? So adjust the recruitment process, and this is really key. I really struggle with interviews because largely they're based on sort of social skills as opposed to, can I do the job? Can I actually work well with other people? Which actually I can, but that's different to, can I do the social small talk around the water cooler? Because that's something I really can't do very well at all. So does that traditional social skills interview work for the role? And does it work for the interviewee who comes in? So if so, if you can, don't need that, if you do need that social skills interview, so say it actually is an important aspect of the role, can you adjust it and accept those differences? So, can you be aware that for instance, I'm not going to make eye contact. That's not me being rude. I just want to be aware that. Expect nervousness to show, and actually, can you give the interview questions ahead of time? And I'd like to know, if you've got a reason, I'd like to know it actually, about why, if you've ever thought, actually, I don't want to give the questions ahead of time. Why is that? I personally would quite like to know, because I think, I don't know if you can really cheat at interviews. Maybe you can. It shows how often I don't do the social skills interview kind of thing. But questions ahead of time can be really important for a number of neurodivergent people because of how we process in real time. So it's not that I don't know how to answer the question, and it's not that I want to sort of rehearse or revise the question as such. It's that when I'm asked something I wasn't prepared for, it's quite difficult for my brain to process in real time, because I would have done a lot of planning mentally before even going into the interview, for instance. Consider your language. So is it positive? Does it, is it inclusive of difference? Do your policies, your documents, mission statements, your job adverts reflect your serious commitment to inclusivity? And do you have to have, or could you do with, a neurodivergent specific policy as well? So a lot of places may have diversity inclusion policies, but do they actually include neurodiversity as well, neurodivergence? This is just very briefly, I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, the differences in language. So we're very much aware that, as a sort of blanket statement, or a blanket go-to, if you like, that people use person first language. So that is to say, for instance, I am a person with a disability, I am a person with autism, or to say, they are a person with autism, for instance. It depends on the community, the type of disability, and the individual about how we like to be described. So for many communities, actually identity first language, that is to put the condition first, is really important because it makes up so much of our experiences of the world. So for me, I am an autistic person. I am not a person with autism. And that's because, as I say, it's very, very intrinsic to how I experience the world, and it's a positive thing for me. And so you've got some examples here. So the deaf community, for instance, reclaimed the narrative about themselves, and deaf became with a capital D to say that they are deaf. And then there are some communities that still use person first language as a preference. So those with mental illnesses, for instance, might prefer person first to say, I have voice hearing, for instance. But it's really important to see that there's a nuance here, and to obviously find out on an individual level how that person might actually want to identify. Be aware of legal obligations, which I'm sure many people are, so I don't think I really need to go into that. Suffice to say, neurodivergence, a lot of neurodivergences are classed as a disability, and so they fall within the Equality Act. But more importantly, these accommodations aren't just about meeting those legal requirements. You will actually genuinely will reap the benefits from accommodating your employees. And so what's good for your neurodivergent employees when you make accommodations is typically good for neurotypical employees too. So while it might be really fundamental for the well-being of autistic individuals to replace the fluorescent lights with better lighting, and that's beneficial for their well-being, neurotypical people will probably appreciate it too, although it might not cause them quite as much distress as it might autistic people. Reward and recognise your neurodivergent employees. For me, this was quite interesting. I wrote a chapter for a book on being autistic in academia, and something that I think I get worried about, I guess, is because I don't do a lot of that sort of socializing around the water cooler and things like that, because I really struggle with it, is how much or how many opportunities I might be missing out on that happen in those like say those after work drinks, or you know, those work do's and work meals. You know, am I missing promotions and things because people forget me, as it were? You know, so to some extent, kind of when you do have those promotion opportunities come up or something like that, do start thinking about all your employees and thinking about the skills and talents they have, and not just focus on the people that you do remember when you go out for work do's and drinks and things. So reasonable adjustments, so changes to working conditions, for example, equipment, duties, hours of work, enables that person with a disability to carry out their job. Think about an individual's needs on an individual basis. I do have here in a second about how this sounds, again, like it might be time consuming, but I think once you've done it, again, you're going to get the most productivity out of all your staff. So don't just assess the best working practices for your neurodivergent employees, do it for everybody. And then you can consider the best practices and environment for everybody on an individual basis. It may take time, but like I say, you will actually reap the benefits from that. And importantly, this doesn't need to be about conditions. So while I obviously have described briefly neurodivergent types, or some of the more common ones that you might come across, you don't actually need to make adjustments based on purely your knowledge of that person being autistic. So it might be just checking with the employee what business adjustments they need. And I've given some links here as well to try and get an idea of how you might go about that, as opposed to just focusing on perhaps quite a narrow idea about what autism is. So like say, some autistic people might be fine with sound, and some might not. But if you have quite a generalized idea about autistic experience, you might just assume, oh, they're autistic, I'll make sure that everything's quiet, and I'll spend money on, I don't know, soft closing doors or something because they keep banging. You know, do you actually need to do that? Can you actually work on, well, what actually do we need per employee to adjust in the business? That's just with a chapter where some of these recommendations have come from. So take time to find out if your employee or colleagues need support returning to the workplace, if that's what they want as well. I think that's quite key. So make a plan. Particularly this will be important for neurodivergent people with anxiety, so autistic, ADHD, social anxiety, those with mental health issues. So really help with sort of baby steps. And I think this should really apply to all employees, because it is going to be a very strange feeling, I think, for many people coming out of lockdown and then going back into the workplace in whatever capacity that is. So maybe a plan for everybody would be quite good. So in terms of considering the workplaces and what things could be useful, so if somebody's got attention differences, are they allowed to stim and fidget? So stim refers to self-stimulatory behaviour, which I always think sounds rude, but the autistic community has sort of reclaimed that that term and calls it stimming. So it's any movement or behaviour, or like say fidgeting with objects perhaps, that helps regulate the sensory processing that person has, and overwhelm perhaps reduces the issues that might come from getting burnt out and overwhelm. So are they allowed? So is it possible that they're allowed to have objects on their desk that they play around with and things like that? And can you normalise that practice? So it's not to say that perhaps you discourage or ban that sort of practice. So having, I'm just looking around what I've got on my desk, I've got squishies and things like this. Perhaps you don't, rule it out that people can do this, but is it a environment and a culture within the workplace where people feel comfortable to do that? So for me, okay, it's a different type of business because I'm lecturing, for instance, students, but I allow all my students, regardless of their neurotype, to bring in objects or borrow objects from me, and I stand up at the front and I have my own objects. So I'm modelling it, if you like, to show that it's okay to need this sort of regulation. And at the very beginning of me starting to do that, I don't think any of my students felt comfortable until they realised I was always going to be doing it, and then more picked it up and more picked it up, because it became a culture of accepting that difference and need in the classroom. So for instance, you might have autistic or anxious or socially anxious individuals who maybe need a quieter space. If this is the case that they're coming back into the workplace, and people with sensory sensitivity. So again, consider some of the things that might be problematic, but find out what people actually struggle with. Another picture of STEM objects. And are you redesigning a workplace with the lessons that lockdown has given us? How do you achieve this new work environment if you have to go back? So have you asked your employees what they need to come back, and if in fact they want to? And have you given them the option to stay at home if they want to? Or can you plan, like say, small steps for re-entry back into work if they do want to return? And this is quite key, because there is some work on not obviously the same situation we have with the pandemic, because it's unprecedented, but for people who've perhaps had a long period away from work and then having to come back into the workplace, some employers may think that they need much more strict control coming back into the workplace, when actually you need flexibility to make it a much more easier, comfortable transition. And I've got links and all in the signposting for you later if you want to look into that. This is just an idea for an example of an inclusive work plan, and it's not necessarily based on the idea of an employee at work. It's actually an individual just considering their own strengths and challenges. But I think this is quite a nice model or template for something you could potentially do with employees. And again, regardless of neurotype, whether they're neurodivergent or neurotypical, can you focus on everybody's main challenges? So here it would be an autistic person talking about the challenges they have. And some key ones here might be filtering out background noise is problematic. They find eye contact, rapidly tiring, and so on and so forth. And then you've got an example. This means that I can get more stressed, and then I realise simply by doing the things that others take in their stride, don't take steps to manage this, and over time that has a negative impact on their mental health. So you can start to see, okay, these are the things they struggle with, this is the outcome, how can we actually prevent this perhaps? Then you've also got the strengths. So this is really always key to focus on after the challenges to show that I know you've got some strengths as well that you bring to the workplace. So focus on their strengths. Right, they're the things that they really do well at. So this means that, for instance, they can work alone for long periods of time and produce tested solutions faster than most, and so on. So how can you foster the strengths, and how can you kind of ameliorate the challenges that they might have? And at the bottom, because like I say, this isn't specifically, I don't think, for the workplace, but it does say I will play to my strengths at work, and be realistic about things that I could do but that might threaten my long-term health, and so on. But it says what I will do about this to get the best out of life. But that might be you as an employer saying what you're going to put in place to actually help with those strengths and challenges. Here in the end, can you bring in a neurodivergent consultant and trainer? And this is some shameless plugging, because I do deliver training to, like I say, all sorts of groups. But that's actually quite key. Even if it's not me, find a seasoned neurodivergent consultant and trainer. And when I say that, I mean somebody who is neurodivergent, because a lot of the time people may bring in neurotypical, so say non-autistic or somebody without ADHD and so on, to deliver training, and they might not quite be able to give you really the practical ideas and knowledge of how to implement those changes and adjustments. So it's quite key to ideally employ a neurodivergent trainer. So how can you structure your physical how can you structure your physical environment and adapt, given you the right people for the role, with flexibility for neurodivergent, disabled and parent employees, for instance? And how can you become an ally to those neurodivergent people? Okay, so I've been aware that Safi is popping things in the box. And I think, am I spot on in terms of time? Because we've got to Q&A attendee scenarios.
Okay, hi, I'm going to take over for just a little bit. So thank you so much for chatting with me on the chat box throughout this. Chloe, great again, thank you very much. I've just been keeping a note of the questions you guys asked and that you've brought with you, and the comments you've been making. And I'm just going to go through and kind of summarise, make sure we've answered some of those questions. If you have more questions, do let me know in the chat box and I'll go through those at the same time, and then we'll hand back over to Chloe after that for some more questions specifically for her if you've got, or we can all turn on our mics and have a chat if there's not too many other. Okay, so the main question, I had one thing that someone specifically wanted answering, and that was how could they very overtly and clearly communicate to or with employees who are neurodiverse in offering them support, but without necessarily outing them in the workplace. So for the trainings that Chloe and I have been doing in the last year or so, we've really been saying try focusing on their strengths and challenges rather than what we call their profile. So autistic might be their profile, but that doesn't necessarily tell you exactly what they're struggling with anyway. But also you can talk about someone's strengths or challenges without focusing on whether they are or aren't autistic or are have attention differences, those kinds of things. So it's a very easy way to discuss things. Usually people are very open to say, oh yeah, I really struggle with X, Y, and Z, but adding a kind of defined profile on it makes things a little more emotional maybe, or a little more difficult. So really using those traits that they have and discussing what works and what doesn't work for them on that level, rather than kind of their overall profile. The other thing that can be really helpful with is if you've got employees who, for example, you might think that they are neurodivergent, but they haven't disclosed that to you or don't consider themselves to be neurodivergent. For example, Chloe's only diagnosed a few years ago, not diagnosed, sorry, only identified as autistic a couple of years ago. So then you can talk to those people and really help them as well, regardless. So Chloe, have you got anything to add on that front?
I was just trying to make sure I've understood what the question was. So, because it was saying, how could I overtly communicate to those employees we are trying to support without necessarily outing them in a neurodivergent workplace? Okay, I think initially when I first read that, I thought it meant as in trying to communicate to the employees around the neurodivergent employees without outing them. But I think the way you've just answered it, I think it's because I misread it the first time.
Okay.
If the person who wrote that wants to just confirm that the way Zafi answered it was the way.
Yeah, either to me or Chloe individually if you don't want to post it on the full one.
And if it were the case of how I read it initially, which was, you know, basically how do you make sure those around a neurodivergent employee kind of support them well without outing the neurodivergent employee, I would say it would be then about fostering that neurodiverse culture. So you are just adapting the environment in preparation for having a neurodivergent employee, as opposed to focusing on somebody you have. Hopefully that makes sense.
So Liz, you posted one just now as well, wondering if as people learn to manage their neurodiversity in a positive way for them, does neuroplasticity happen as it would for, say, trauma, if that makes sense, within other neurodiverse groups? So Liz, are you trying to say that as they learn to manage it, do we see like brain changes that would allow them to cope with it better? Is that?
I would say, Liz, what I see with people that I support and within the autistic community, for instance, so I can't talk about lots of different communities because I'm not part of them, but in terms of the autistic community, it's hard to say about the neuroplasticity, but I would say that being around other autistic people, for instance, being in an autistic friendly environment kind of means that you struggle less. So you're challenged less by your environment. So I wouldn't necessarily say that that's then going to have major changes on the brain per se. But obviously anybody who's in an environment that is suited to them means that their well-being in general is going to improve. Sorry, I'm just reading that last one. So Oliver said it to everyone, so I'm assuming that's okay to read it out. So I do a great deal of masking as an autistic person. Yeah, definitely. So it's quite a common thing for a lot of us. So the plasticity for me comes in methods of masking, but the underlying issue that forces me to mask remains. So positive ways of management is developing masking skills and adapting masking to different situations. Yeah, it's important to note that masking is very stressful and affects mental health too. Yes, so masking is quite an interesting one if you've not come across it before. It's basically a lot of not just adult diagnosed autistics, it can also be those who are diagnosed quite young, but we kind of end up hiding our autistic selves, if you like, because of stigma, you know, negative responses from other people who don't understand some of the behaviours that we might have and things like that. It's protective, but at the same time it makes you, I mean, it's exhausting as well because you're constantly having to remind yourself, largely unconsciously, okay, when I'm in this scenario or this situation, this is how I should behave, and trying to remind yourself not to do certain behaviours you would normally do automatically as an autistic person. That's very exhausting, and it does lead to poor mental well-being. So really what people need is an environment where that masking doesn't have to happen. Methods of masking. So positive ways of management is developing masking. Yeah. So if you can, even if it's small spaces at a time, so I have other projects that I do and programs that I run specifically for autistic students, but we also are hoping to do it with other groups as well, to help people, even if it's just 2 hours a week, being in an autistic friendly space where they don't have to have that mask, and just those 2 hours a week can actually improve well-being. So yeah, that's quite important when it comes to the masking.
Fantastic. So were there any other questions at all that you came with that you feel like haven't been answered, or that have occurred to you during it that Chloe and I can help with? While you guys think about that, I'm just going to cover the ideas that you guys came up with for dealing with the customer-facing autistic individual. So the ones that got put forward were: one, get someone else to greet and meet, and then pass on the specific info or suggest that they are an online chat customer or customer service advisors. Fantastic if you've got a way that removes some of the social stresses or something like that for an individual that has finds the social interaction quite stressful, and there are ways that you can remove that element from the job, then fantastic. That's a really great way of supporting that individual. But there are some jobs that maybe you have a customer facing element that can't be removed from the job role. So there are things like another one here: if the employee is comfortable, a badge or some kind of indication that that individual's not doesn't like handshakes or doesn't like eye contact. But clearly the individual employee has to be super comfortable with that, because that's about declaring something publicly that they might not want to.
Because when we put these together, that was my consideration as one of my things that I thought could potentially work, which is a badge, which I personally would feel happy and comfortable wearing, because I am much more openly autistic nowadays, etc., etc. So I'm glad somebody else came up with that. But yes, I definitely wouldn't want to force or enforce that on somebody if they don't feel comfortable.
Yeah, and then say that they don't have to do that particular behaviour, but they have to adhere to other social things that they might be more comfortable with. So particular forms of verbal greeting, being very clearly polite and welcoming verbally, if not in their kind of physical eye contact and that kind of thing, would be a really good way. And then it may be talking to other employees to say, you know, I know we asked you guys to do this, but you know, if you want to do it the other way as well, that's absolutely fine. But you know, we just need to be polite and welcoming to our customers, but maybe not in such a traditional sense. And then I quite like this one: if there's no negative feedback on it, then maybe it's not as important, and we could remove the restriction or rule anyway. I mean, absolutely. Sometimes we find that there are social and business practices that are there simply because we've decided that's the way we do it, but there's no necessarily good reason. So if someone's doing it differently and it's providing good results, then why keep the superfluous rule anyway? So it's definitely something.
I love number 4. Number 4 is a great response. I just want to pick up because Liz's saying that they're having to go. So thank you so much for attending and for leaving that lovely bit of feedback. That's really nice. Thank you.
Paul, I know that you've messaged me. I will read it in just a second. And so then the suggestions, read the chef, explain the attention difficulties to other staff members. This is so important, I think, to make sure that other people are aware as much as possible without disclosing personal information about somebody, but to make sure that there's a kind of a good kind of group atmosphere and understanding of all employees, not just the one maybe that you're focusing on or that you're concerned about. Have set process for key moments of stress, warning cards or safe spaces. This is a really good idea, because for a lot of people, if they've got a set thing that they can follow, then it relieves some of the stress, but also gives them a way to manage it and to give other people around them warning that that stress is occurring. Because one of the things is because the brain works in different ways, the stress being incurred by one person may not be evident to the other people around, because they're not aware of those stresses at all, because they're not things that stress them or make life more challenging for them.
And that was one that I came up with the chef, which is it possible for them to have like a red card, and then everybody understands that, you know, okay, we're stopping this conversation now if it's getting too intense or something, so that he can walk away. So I'm glad somebody else came up with that as well. This is great.
So leading by example to give him more space and time to communicate. I think the emphasis on that one was like as the manager to do that. That's such an important thing for changing culture is to lead from the top. So I think that's a really, really good one. If you see your manager exemplifying negative behaviours, you're going to instantly lead negatively into that behaviour from the individual anyway. Whereas if you're seeing it being accepted, then you know it's something that is okay in the environment that you're working in, and you're more likely to work with it in a positive manner. And other ways of communicating, this is so important. Chloe went through a little bit earlier about how some people will prefer to write or can express themselves in a different way in different forms of communication. So if there is a way of doing some of these communications, maybe non-verbally or not face-to-face, then it's very possible that that could de-escalate some situations or stop some situations from ever happening in the first place, if you've been able to communicate differently. Chloe, have you got anything to add on those?
No, they were great. That was lovely.
Really, thank you so much for sending those in. I think that was the majority. We had such an interesting range of strengths and challenges from you guys about yourselves and the employees. And the one thing I wanted to highlight, oh, thank you so much. I don't know your name, 2497. Thanks for joining. One of the things I want to highlight for the strengths and challenges is that the same things come up as both strengths and challenges for different people. So, for example, creativity came up as strength for quite a few of you, but also a challenge for a couple of you. So really using those strengths and challenges to find a balanced and healthy workforce is amazing. Chloe, have you got anything to add as we reach the end?
I don't think so. I mean, I think the last, because I know we're, so that's 2 people that had to disappear. So I'm so grateful that they were here. But if anybody does have any other scenarios, like actual scenarios that you've experienced or things that you'd like some answers for, otherwise I did have some reflective questions, which I've popped back up on the screen. So I think everyone can still see the screen. So should you return to normal post-lockdown, is that right for you, your workplace, your employees, on a case-by-case basis? So something just to consider. Have you attended any, like say, autistic and or neurodiversity training, and was it led by actually autistic or neurodivergent individuals? Consider your sources of information about neurodivergent experience. So does it include those neurodivergent perspectives, or is it just, you know, non-autistic, for instance, researchers explaining things? So it might not say quite what you might need to know actually to put things in practice in the workplace. Scrutinise your internal attitudes. Although saying that, there's been some great suggestions and things, so I don't even know necessarily that this is one. Although saying that, we should always, every single individual, scrutinise their internal attitudes. But can you think about those things relating to neurodivergent people? So if you learnt that a colleague, for instance, is autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, after a period of knowing them, did that actually affect your attitudes toward them? If so, was it for the better or worse? Prior, were they competent yet awkward and quirky? And after, were they less agentic, less capable, and you pitied them? So again, because my discovering that I was autistic kind of came about halfway through me doing my PhD, and I do think that for the most part, when I disclosed to the school, that it was fantastic responses, and like I say, my admin manager was really great, trying to understand and support me, while still treating me like I was capable, because I am. I just have this extra thing that now can explain why I don't do social interaction very often, and certainly not around a water cooler kind of thing. But I have had experiences where I've disclosed to people, not necessarily in the workplace, where I do feel that their attitude towards me had changed, even though I hadn't, other than to disclose something extra, I guess, about myself. And sometimes we just need to be aware of that, I guess. Oh, I've had a private message. I'll come back to that one in a second, so I don't want to say it out loud. And how does your workplace consider the reasonable accommodations that employees with visible and invisible disabilities need, and how can it do better? And my last one, so those are just sort of reflective questions. So you're going to get these, this PowerPoint anyway. So those are things you can take away and think about at other points. But I would be interested to know if everybody's got sort of 3 things they can commit to improving in your workplace for neurodivergent and or disabled people. So your existing employees and how to attract neurodivergent talent. So if anyone's got anything relating to that, I'd be quite interested to hear. I'm just going to pop back to this private chat quickly. Let me just double check. I think after this, I'll bring this back up if you are looking at that question. But just to let you know, I'm not going to go through these, but I've got all these on the PowerPoint as well for you. So there's lots of links here from the research that I was doing on different signposting, different resources, different toolkits and things like that. So I've put those all together for you, so when you take the PowerPoint away, you've got things to look into in more depth if you need to. Safi, anything else while I reply to Oliver?
Yeah, so we did have a comment, or I got something earlier about kind of institutional and organisational level change and how that can be challenging. We all know that in large organisations, making changes will face often backlash. So, you know, and understandably that makes it very difficult. So I guess there are things you can do at the individual level to support the individual, but possibly at some point it may be that you have to face some of that backlash and make kind of top level change in order to see a kind of lower level cultural change take place. Also, you know, as Chloe said, getting an experience-led trainer in can really help break down some of those barriers. As she said, she's seen some of that change just in a room from her training sessions. That first person experience is so powerful. I've watched it happen in several rooms and watched people's opinions and beliefs change on that subject and just a deeper level of understanding. So it's a hard one, I know, and it's going to be very, very difficult. If you've got specific questions about how you might think about approaching it, then Chloe's clearly the person to ask about that. But I think, like with all big changes and with all kind of stigma-based things, at some point the first step has to be taken, but it's not necessarily going to be a one-step wonder or pleasant for everyone. So Chloe, have you got anything else you'd like to add on that front?
Was that about going back into the workplace?
More kind of large organisational change, making it more, you know, as an HR department, for example, if you're trying to institute more organisational change, you are going to face some backlash and some people that don't understand or don't think it's the right move, and about dealing with that.
I think a lot of the time it is just fear of change and something different. And that's something that's typically what autistic people struggle with, but actually neurotypical people really struggle with change too. So when it's things that I would consider quite straightforward and sort of basic really, people might be concerned that, I'm trying to think of an example. So the participation cards that I use within seminars and things like that, they're such a straightforward thing for me personally, but I think they're just very alien if you're not used to doing something like that. So allowing people in a space to decide how they want to participate by using a little card, or like we said with the example of the chef, if you know you have that chef with the attention differences, he's quite impulsive, and so sometimes his communication kind of gets him in trouble. Is he allowed to have a little red card and people be aware of that? You know, some people might fear that kind of change and, oh, but if we do that for him, we'll have to do it for everyone. And it's kind of like, not everybody needs those accommodations. And I think it's remembering that too. And I don't think it's, for me anyway, I don't think it seems like, I think it seems like a lot more energy and time consuming things than it actually might be. Does that make sense? put in little things in place.
Yeah, one of the other things, I was just thinking about it, one of the other things in our work with academics is about offering kind of choice, saying, look, here's a range of things that you could do. This was specifically for lecturing and seminars and things like that. Here's a range of things that might support the people in your group. But it's really important that, and maybe this would work for managers as well, it's really important that the person providing those believes in them and is supportive of them too, because there's nothing kind of more damaging in a way than the person giving them being quite dismissive of them. So maybe developing like a range of things and being like, look, we need you to do some of them, but if there's some that you're really not comfortable with, then, you know, we can talk about it, or you can try out these other ones first. Or they're just offering people different ways to start to engage in it in a positive way. But for example, in a seminar situation, you wouldn't want your lecturer to start making, if you've got the kind of participation cards, to make disparaging or dismissive remarks about people who are and aren't using them, and therefore make the cards themselves stigmatized. That kind of backfires on you and takes away from what you're trying to achieve as an organization. So kind of by saying, you know, you can use the cards and lots of people find them really helpful, but you could also do these other things to support people instead, then people can use the ones that are most matching with how they teach or how they manage and that kind of thing. So, perfect. Chloe, anything else or any other questions?
Unless there's anything from those that are left that you want to ask, or any comments or anything, you're welcome. Otherwise, does Marcus or anyone want to pop back on? Oh, there's Marcus.
Absolutely phenomenal. You put a huge amount of effort into that. So really thank you to both of you for all of that, and the way that you conducted that as well. That was brilliant. I think that, you know, points around every workplace is neurodiverse, when you're talking about sort of Zoom fatigue, and actually understanding what that really is, because we talk about it and it's been a sentence or a phrase that's used now almost every day, but really understanding what that is and what we can take from that, I found really fascinating. The benefits of lockdown was really interesting, and as owner managers are, I wouldn't say running back to the workplace, but considering now what the workplace now looks like, fascinating to hear about. Actually, there are some things that we can really take from a lockdown. Obviously, it's sad around the circumstances that it was attached to, but what we can learn from that and how we can sort of apply those.